I'll accept it from the Internal Revenue Service. And our service is based on voluntary compliance, a faith and belief that the service is on their side.
But every American, if we're going to have voluntary compliance at the high rate we continue to have in America, it's got to be perceived as a fair system. That what's asked of me is also asked of him or her. And
our voluntary tax system depends on our taxpayers trusting that it works fairly.
The most important measure to me is the voluntary compliance rate. Going forward, are they voluntarily compliant as opposed to what they did in the past?
The very functioning of the federal government depends on the American people's willingness to voluntarily pay the taxes that they owe.
To having to prove themselves again after they already did with voluntary tax compliance.
So being able to communicate with them in language, on writing, online, and whatnot is very important to us. And that helps the front end, which helps the voluntary compliance rate.
We believe also that lack of congressional support for the IRS could adversely affect individuals' attitudes towards participation in our voluntary compliance tax system.
And what is the purpose of an audit conducted by the IRS?
To hopefully make sure that people, when they are voluntarily complying, are complying with the statutes.
To me, voluntary compliance is really the name of the game, because enforcement is so expensive. So you want people to feel that the agency is using its power legitimately.
We rely on voluntary compliance for our tax system, but we have systematically undercut the ability of the IRS to deal with voluntary compliance.
I'm a believer we need a successful IRS, both from the enforcement side and the voluntary compliance side. And the voluntary compliance side ties into trust and respect for us, and we need to earn that.
Because of that, our voluntary tax system has been a model for the world. It really is, at least until recently. Our hearing demonstrated how our system of voluntary compliance has come under assault.
The integrity of the nation's voluntary tax compliance system depends on a modernized IRS and a modernized infrastructure.
And that really would encourage taxpayers to voluntarily comply with the tax law, essentially own up to those sources of income.
Because our tax system relies mostly on voluntary compliance.
In conclusion, our tax system relies on voluntary compliance. Historically, the rate of voluntary compliance has been fairly stable.
Great things about it is a largely voluntary system, one of the most voluntary in the world. I think we're now at 87% or something like that.
From taxpayers that earn their income and reported with a W-2 with a 99% voluntary compliance rate.
The investments we're making in helping people get it right are going to mean that voluntary compliance rates also go up, which mean that we're going to make even more revenue. Our estimate's somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 billion.
And yes, there is confusion in the way that people comply with our tax code. And historically, we've had a high compliance because it's been voluntary compliance. Everyone believes they're being treated fairly under our system, but that's no longer the case.
Taxpayers want to know that their neighbor across the street or next door is paying their fair share. So I do think that is a foundational piece of voluntary compliance.
We do believe that having those minimum standards will help the tax system, the voluntary compliance system.
Of course there's a tax gap. Duh. I mean, we have a voluntary system. And when we first imposed an income tax in America, and the constitutionality of it was litigated,